Understanding trauma, a comprehensive perspective. All right. This is going to lead into journal prompt 10, defining and understanding trauma. Then we're going to talk about the power of trauma. I told you we're talking about trauma, impact on emotional repression and internal external environments. And then exercise 9, understanding your emotional repression patterns. Right. When I really learned to deconstruct trauma in a profound way is when I understood what trauma was. And as an energy worker, I stopped just looking at kind of the more colloquial ways that we understand trauma, the more academic ways that we understand trauma. And I just sought to understand the energy of trauma. So I'm sitting with it, and I'm an energy expert, right? I'm sitting with it, and I couldn't grab anything. I could not grab anything. And that's when I realized trauma is not a type of energy. Trauma is a way that we package other energies. It's a skin for energy, but it's not an energy all its own. Once it goes into that skin, it forms its own kind of thing that really becomes destructive. But remove that input from trauma and just try to feel trauma for yourself. It doesn't feel like anything. Okay, it doesn't feel sad. It doesn't feel like anything. It feels like whatever you put in it. And this is important because we don't seem to understand what trauma is, and it's very limiting for us. Once we understand that trauma is not this thing that just happens, it's a thing that we package, then we have power. Now, as children, we were very immature. We didn't know what we know now. So as adults, we need to meet the version of ourselves that experienced that trauma. That's important, okay? And we need to address how they internalize and package that trauma. Because if you're only looking at it from your point of perspective right now, you're going to miss a lot of the trauma because you're going to dismiss it as not being important, but it was. And so you need to get down at the level of the 3-year-old that experienced the trauma, the 13-year-old, the 26-year-old. You need to meet them to get the trauma. But understand, what's traumatic for one person isn't traumatic for the other. It's how we package and internalize our pain that makes it trauma. My father died when I was a little girl. That was very traumatic for me. Would I package it the same as a little girl as I would if I was 70 years old when my father died? No, I would package it completely different. So was it traumatic that my father died? Or was what I said about my father dying and what it meant about my place in this world, my safety in this world, my ability to be loved in this world, my ability for people to stay there in this world, that was traumatic. It's always going to be what I say. And in this way, this is a very empowering thought, because then you start to understand that you are the assigner of value, and things don't have value unless you give it value. And then you package it inside of yourself, right? Again, when we were young, we had very immature views of ourselves in the world. So what do a lot of us do? We put ourselves at the center of all of the trauma that was happening between us, right? Our parents divorced. It must be my fault. Why do we do that? Because if everything is my fault, then I have the power to do something about it when I am otherwise powerless as a child. But if it is everyone else's fault, the adult's fault, and I don't have any power to get them to act differently, then I am in a very unsafe situation. Again, the ego always wants to make us safe. Always. All right? Even if that means taking the blame for things that you should not take the blame for, because in taking the blame, you will believe that you have control to change it. Does that make sense? I'll never forget hearing about a rich person talk about how they didn't have any designer clothes in high school. Their mother would not let them have designer clothes. And they were framing it as something that was very traumatic for them. And a lot of people kind of like, that's silly. And I really thought, no, I don't know why we're all walking around thinking that for our trauma to be legitimate, we have to measure it against other people's pain. And we have to, it's not more or less than this, so then we have a right or no right to it. No, no one's doing that. And this also allows us to heap a lot of trauma on future generations because, well, it's less than the trauma that we experience, except they don't have our context. They only have theirs. Your worst trauma is your worst trauma. If your worst trauma is the lack of belonging that you felt because you didn't have the designer clothes that other kids had, so you felt unsafe, you felt like you didn't belong, that caused issues with ego. It's the same thing if those issues were caused because I was molested. It's no different because I've internalized it the same way because that's all the context I have, right? So this has really helped me understand trauma in a much softer way because I used to be dismissive. Like, I'll be honest with y'all, I was abusive to my older son, but I thought it was okay because I was not abusive the way my mother was. And my mother was very abusive to me, but she was not abusive in the way that her parents were. Except I didn't have that context. I only had my context. My son only had his. So instead of us racking and stacking trauma, we need to listen to all of it. And that starts within ourselves. We need to really hold space for anything that we might have decided was traumatic, even if it seems really immature and silly to us from our point in perspective right now. It could be very traumatic that you moved homes when you were a small child and you left your favorite home. It might be very traumatic that you lost your favorite pet or your favorite stuffed animal or a blankie. It might be very traumatic to you that your grandmother who was with you for the first 3 years of your life died. From your point of view now, it might seem like such petty small things, but that's not how it was internalized. It was internalized from the viewpoint of the 3-year-old who lost their grandmother, who had something ripped from them in a very dramatic way that made them question their safety in this world. I must heal from the perspective of the 3-year-old. And to do that, I have to hold radical space for myself and for my right to have experienced things the way that I did. Because what I see so often is I always see people say things like, my mom hurt me, she did this to me, but she did the best that she could. It's very dismissive to you. I don't care what grace you want to give your parents, what grace you want to give other people for hurting you. That's something you do after you elevate your feelings around that subject instead of dismissing them. Because the second you start to talk about your pain and then you center excuses for why that pain was heaped upon you, you're dismissing your pain. And if you will not even hold it, you are in no position to let it go. All right. So accountability will always be assigned. Make sure that you're not taking on too much of the accountability for yourself by keeping it from others. A lot of you guys think if I admit that I was traumatized by somebody, that means I can't be in a relationship with them anymore. It's not what that means. That means that they're a bad person. That's not what it means. It just means that you're honoring your feelings and you're highlighting them and making them a priority. And until you're able to do that, you'll keep repressing those feelings around that trauma and you will never allow that trauma to heal. Okay? So repression happens because I refuse to acknowledge the pain that I am experiencing. And if I'm refusing to acknowledge it, then I'm causing more pain to myself. Period. I'm dismissing myself. I'm doing the opposite of the very things that I need. I need to be heard. I need my pain to be seen. I need my pain to be validated. But you're refusing to do it for yourself because it's easier to just pack it away. I'll deal with that mess later. Except the longer that mess stays there, the more it will infect everything. It is not meant to be held. No energy is meant to be packaged and held for any length of time. It's meant to move through you. It's meant to be released. It's meant to be enjoyed, learned from, and then released. All right? So not acknowledging trauma and repression go hand in hand. We have to acknowledge trauma so that we can express the pain around that and get rid of it so that we can heal.